complicated, you know, man. Like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. Like talking about blue, red, man. Then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, Isaac, welcome to the show. How you doing, man?
Good, man. I love your intro. I've never actually seen it before because I've heard it many times, but I've never seen the visuals, which is equally perfect. It's great.
Yeah, it's funny. It's very much a polarizing thing. 80% of people really like it, and then there's a small minority who are like, you got to change it. It's stupid, which is really just like entrenched by opinions that is never changing. It's like, this is not a democracy, and your consent is not required to.
Dude, there's always going to be if you don't have haters, you're doing something wrong. Is what I say. So
yeah, definitely. So
what is the speech? Is that from King of the Hill?
Yeah, it is. It's Boomhauer from King of the Hill. Oh no, it's from King of the Hill, which is a show I just watched a lot as a kid and really liked, and I don't know why it's just burned into my brain. And yeah, obviously it was a little self-serious to have it without like a little bit of hint of humor in it, you know? And so I thought that little mix was probably about perfect for the rest of the show, because it is, mostly just kind of serious, depressing topics. And every once in a while you just say something stupid just to, keep spirits up, I guess. But
absolutely. No, I think it's perfect. I think it's a perfect little, the first one of those that I saw that was really good was Astral's pod. Mm-hmm. Had a great intro. And so I kind of tried to imitate him, and yours is even better. And I guess we're all trying to be a little bit like Bap's great intro on Caribbean rhythms.
So, yeah, I think we all are kind of following the same couple guys there. But just so we can get into it, I was on your show a while back, had a really great time. But for people who necessarily aren't familiar with you and what you do, could you give kind of a napkin sketch of who you are and what you do on the internet?
Yeah, so I think the reason for my like relatively quick success is I thought a lot about. I've been posting shit on the internet for like 12 years, right? And I've been doing a lot of the stuff that a lot of the guys in our space have been doing since before they have. I published self-published books. I've been doing readings. I've been doing blogging of all different kinds for like 12 years. And so I actually have a ton of experience in these fields, right? The difference is that I started as a complete normie and not an online guy at all. Totally posting by myself under various blogs. I started getting hired by Vice and by like LA Weekly back in the day. I got paid by Medium as like one of their early writers type of thing. And I didn't fully become like actually outwardly for sure right wing under my name until about a year and a half ago. Like where I was no holds barred, fuck it, I'm out, right? Sorry for swearing. I don't know. Do you guys keep it clean on here? Or,
No. You're good.
Okay. Yeah, I still haven't decided whether I like want to swear as a policy or not. But anyway, so I kind of floated in and out of these circles, and simultaneously, as a professional person, I started working in advertising. I'm trained as a lawyer. I was quite good at law. I passed the bar, but then I just. I actually couldn't even get a job in law. I tell the story of, I hated it. And I did hate it, but I also tried to get a job in it and failed. And so I did get jobs in advertising. And that was perfect for me because advertising is a great balance between being really creative and being also like smart in a business sense. So, I got to certain heights as an advertising guy concurrently with blogging, being kind of a gonzo writer. I had a podcast, an old podcast for a while. But, I couldn't really crack through in any really satisfying way. It was like I couldn't get really high enough in the mainstream world. Like I would bump up against the bottom of like the New York Times or, Vanity Fair, right? And I couldn't really get over the hump there, right? And simultaneously, I was becoming more and more right wing. I genuinely believe this stuff. Like I genuinely, I was very pro Trump, and I really didn't have any connection to the internet. And so to make a long story short, there were sort of these two concurrent paths going for a very long time, being an internet writer and then being an advertising guy. And about 2 years ago, after, again, reaching a certain height in the mainstream branding world as a creative director, I just decided, you know what, man, I'm done pretending, and I'm going to do both of these things in service of our movement. And that's what I've been doing basically for 2 years. And so I have the Carousel, which is my blog and podcast that's on Substack. I have my Twitter account, which is Disgraced Propagandist. And then I have my business, which is called Will. And Will does branding and marketing and media creation, et cetera, for people in our space.
Yeah, I think that, what you mentioned of not being able to sort of break in is a pretty common theme for a lot of people. Because, one of the things people always talk about is like, oh, like things have become so politicized. And, the classic lefty response is always like, oh, things are always politicized. And it's actually not true, right? If you read Land, he talks about how the dialogue, things becoming politicized, is sort of like the engine of the left, right? They thrive in dialogue. And, as a part of that, right, you have things which were in the past sort of considered assumed wisdom, right? Like neither, for all of his faults, a man like Woodrow Wilson, who was considered a progressive at his time, wasn't really debating about, like what is the nature of marriage, right? Things on that level were kind of assumed. And as things start to fray, more and more of society becomes, quote unquote, politicized, right? It comes up for a decision in the Schmittian sense. And as a part of that, right, I think most people's normal mode of being is not particularly political, right? There's always weirdos and autists who are interested in these things. But what we've seen is that, the classic line about the Vietnam War, right? Like, you don't care about the war cares about you, has sort of hit politics, right? And so I see a lot of guys basically, realizing that they're sort of either in their work, when it comes to advancement, when it comes to their personal interests, that politics has sort of sought them out. Recently Microsoft was bragging about the fact that they across the board just pay white people less than other racial groups. And even if it's not so explicit, you do kind of realize, if you're in one of those groups that the regime does not approve of, and, white men is probably the top of the list, but there are others as well, we could get into, that you sort of look around and you're like, wait a minute, why am I on your side again? Like, why should I be a part of this thing when you've just decided, to kind of pick on me? And so I think that common experience of trying to do the thing you're supposed to do, right? Trying to go to college, trying to advance in your career, and then realizing like, wait, sensitive young men need not apply. You start to kind of look around and like, okay, well, what are my options? And so I think that there's kind of two categories, right? Like, when you talk about becoming more right wing, some of that is personality based, some of that's experience based. But another part is it's like, well, I mean, these scary right wingers don't hate me, which is a pretty good start. So when you're talking about, becoming more right wing, what were the ideas that sort of pulled you down that rabbit hole?
I've learned since listening to your last podcast or our podcast together that I need to pay very close attention to what you're saying, because you say very, very insightful things. And, a lot of people that you podcast with is kind of like, you're kind of multitasking. Whereas with you, I know I need to really focus on what you're saying. And I recognize that from listening to our past pod together, because there were so many like hugely great, valuable gems in what you said that I sort of like missed. So I'm like dedicating myself to like really listening to what you're saying. I think that though, it's that said, I think I have to disagree slightly on the characterization that I'm like apolitical and then I kind of got pushed into it. That's not really true. Like, I was always an inflammatory asshole in every environment that I was in. Like I remember, I grew up in the most liberal environment possible. And of course, I had no consciousness of being right wing. But even back then, I remember one time the social studies teacher like putting all the women in the classroom on one side and putting me on the other side and having us just argue about like gender roles, like before this was so fraught. So I've always been an asshole. I've always been a contrarian. And I tend to believe genuinely the right left distinction is basically spiritual. It's basically ingrained. You know, it's like if you have a relationship with God from an early age, there is just no way in today's world, right, that you're going to end up being left wing. It's just not going to happen. So I think, I mean, of course, that changes throughout history. I think there's been times in history, you know, during the Inquisition, perhaps, where you might have looked at what was going on as a godly person and been like, hell no, like that's not what God is either, right? But I think right now, if you are a person that has is a believer in any way, you can't possibly look at the world and think that what is going on with the left is the right direction. So I don't really think I have much of a choice. And I also don't think that I was pushed there. I think it was more that the world changed and I just didn't change with it really. And then when I saw Trump coming up, I mean, I had visited I'll tell you one thing two things were really, really impactful. One was in New Orleans, I worked for Big Oil when I was in law school. And I was representing people that were defending the Deepwater Horizon, right? Which for a liberal who grew up in the environment I lived in was essentially Satan, right? Like I essentially was working for Satan. And I remember like hanging out with these lawyers and, you know, in the South in New Orleans, I was around something I'd never been around before, which was cool right wingers. You know, like I was around young guys who were cool and they were right wing, like openly. So I was like, these guys are actually way cooler than the people that I grew up with. And we talked about what was going on with the Deepwater Horizon. And, you know, they showed me a picture once of a bunch of kayakers protesting or, you know, protesters on kayakers, like holding signs. And they were just like, where do you think that plastic comes from for those kayaks? And I was like, oh, where? I didn't think about this. And they were like, it comes from the Deepwater Horizon. It comes from the thing that they're protesting, which, you know, made me kind of look at it in a different way. I also, you know, when you study law, I think you see definitely the seams and the things the leftists were saying didn't make any sense to me, but also around the Second Amendment, particularly. So that happened. And then being out here, oh yeah, when I was working for Vice, I went and I did a tour of the Rust Belt in America, and I saw the devastation. And that was why I think I was so early on Trump compared to most people, because I had seen that, and Trump was the only person talking about it. And I was like, well, there's no way that can happen without there being some backlash to it. And so, you know, I was a Bernie bro, dude. I was a Bernie bro, and I Bernie broed over to Trump, which was the only thing that made any sense to me. I can't believe anybody didn't do that, frankly. So again, yeah, I don't know if I'm necessarily like someone who was pushed as much as I just kind of stayed the same, and the world, you know, the world changed.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point. You know, there's this sort of like sociological phenomenon where in general, you know, people talk about kind of like, oh, you know, when you leave university, you know, when you leave college, you hit the real world, all those liberal ideas kind of, you know, fall off. And, you know, maybe there's something to that. I think another part of it is that the you know, the university system is basically just like ideological conditioning, and you sort of leave there frozen in amber and the world does kind of move on. But I think that that's true for some people, but you miss that sort of like experience with reality, you know, because you're 100% right about activists being genuinely the worst people in the world. And, you know, I've certainly had experiences, you know, like I mentioned before, you know, when I was in college, I had a very early bad experience with a progressive activist. And I think that if you have a certain personality, especially that kind of like contrarianism streak where you're just like, fuck you, no.
Yeah.
You know, you meet that person and you're like, I have no rational reason. I can't argue you, but I hate you.
I just hate
you.
you.
That kind of brainstem reaction.
What was it? What happened?
Oh, I thought I may have mentioned this. I can't remember, but I went to, you know, university. I ended up dropping out at a small, like prestigious liberal arts school. and I signed up for a class. I'll say it briefly because I've said it before, called Game Theory, assuming this would be economic game theory, and it turns out it was critical theory of video games. And so I had this like literal
game theory.
This literal like goblin sitting in front of me telling me,
Oh
and
my
I'm
God.
like play like a game like maybe once or twice a year. I'm not a gamer, don't identify as such. But me basically being forced to take a Gamergate class at the collegiate level.
Oh wow.
And so I was just like, I despise you. Like it's such a root level. And that was a very kind of impactful moment for me, because it was like you see that kind of, and it's moralizing. Don't get me wrong. And I think there's a trap that says like, oh, the problem is the moralizing. The problem is having standards at all. But it is a mix of kind of like the school hall monitor moralizing mixed with these just being like awful, miserable people who are just kind of intent on inflicting their misery on everyone else. And so it was like, I think that just kind of like blind destruction of like, oh, like, I'm going to take something that works and ruin it, or turn it to my ends, I think is a very, very powerful motivating force to just oppose whatever that is.
Totally. Yeah. And it's just it's a repellent, it's repellent. And I mean, honestly, like I grew up like I was a full on wigger, so I was like mostly around Black people growing at certain phases of growing up, like the main phase. And the thing about the Black community that was really different from the white community, because I grew up kind of in both in Evanston. Evanston is like really like the progressive experiment, like made flesh. It's the only place in the country that has reparations, by the way, like real reparations. So, the difference in the communities was really the Black community was very based, like that's the thing. The Black community, in terms of the values of the right today, the Black community was very anti-gay, very anti like anything resembling like censorship of your ideas in any way. I mean, it was rap. It was, and what are these rap songs? It's all about getting money. It's about, this is going to sound completely ridiculous to your audience, but it's about personal responsibility, right? So rappers aren't rapping about getting welfare checks, like they're rapping about the opposite. Whereas the ultra progressive white community I grew up in was always, it was gay shit 24/7. It was like, oh, put the gay kid in front. These like progressive Jewish temples, it's like fucking rainbow flags and lesbian rabbis and shit. And then also the churches are kind of the same. I mean, Evanston's the ultra liberal. And so, it was like, even from a very, very early age, I had access to people who kind of like said no to this shit. Like I think a lot of our guys, they never had any way out. They were just so indoctrinated. And since they were all from like nice white communities, there was just no way for them to see anything else. And then they discovered the internet where people were saying the truth and they were like, whoa, like, holy shit. Like there's a whole other world out there. Whereas I'm a little different because I really come from a very like different place, I think, than like most of these other people. I don't know. I don't know if that even answers your question at all, but yeah, or if that was a question, I don't know.
No, certainly. Do you think that there is an additional perspective that kind of reformed progressives can offer to our guys, having been kind of inside the belly of the beast, so to speak?
Yeah. I think the great thing about the reform progressive side is we can offer a lot aesthetically. I think that the right does not have an aesthetic tradition. Yeah, and I think they make up their own aesthetics that work in their own way. Like a MAGA hat, right, is kind of awesome. It's actually kind of the coolest thing ever, really, if you think about it, and way cooler than anything that any kind of like artist would ever create. But I think that what my mission is, and pretty much everyone in my little area, is to make it cool, genuinely cool, to be right wing, and that means looking cool. And I think that that's something that the right really struggles with. And in certain ways, I mean, there are parts of the country where there is a certain swagger and a certain kind of unassailable coolness Like like being a kind of bro in South Carolina, or, the rich kids in New Orleans where I went to law school. They had a very cool swagger that was aesthetic in its own way, right? But it wasn't artistic. And I think that people like me and like Yarvin and Bap, we kind of come from this world of artistic consciousness. And I think that we can apply some of the lessons from that to our movement.
Yeah, there's something to that. And I think that the hard part about the term the right is that it's sort of a negative definition, right? It's everyone who isn't on the left. And so it encompasses kind of multiple camps at once. Like you have like our weird kind of gonzo scene, right? Which is probably the only place that new interesting discussions are really happening, on the internet. I've dabbled in the kind of like, post-left, dirtbag left scene. And like, to be honest, all the interesting ideas they have are because they're talking to our friends, to be perfectly blunt about it. I mean, let alone look at the wasteland that is like the liberal progressive world, right? But I think that what you have is that, right? Which does have a sort of like anarchistic creative spirit to it. Things are going on that are interesting. But you also have the kind of like holdover of the college Republican types who have no aesthetic sensibility whatsoever.
Right.
And part of that, right, is that the Republicans are the losers.
Yes.
Right? Like they are set up to lose.
Yes, and they look like the losers.
Exactly.
Yeah, totally.
And so like think about it, right? Like if you're an ambitious, like Machiavellian, just absolutely horrible person, right? The kind who would make a really good politician. I mean, like which team do you join? Right? Like even if you have, because let's be honest, right? Like, Gavin Newsom is an amazing politician visually. Like he gets it.
I don't know. Everybody says this. I don't know if I really agree with this, but I know that everybody on our side says this. I think that everybody, but again, this is a little bit loserdom in action, because this is our side thinks Newsom is awesome, but Newsom's side does not think Newsom is awesome. Right.
So my point is not that Newsom is a particularly like good or effective person, but my point is that like if you are Gavin Newsom, right, because he doesn't seem to be a particularly like idealistic guy, who do you go for, right? He doesn't become a Republican.
Okay. Yes. I think that's very fair. Right. Well, and it's also he's playing it as it lays in his environment, right? But like where he is, where he's from, which is a cultural center, extremely powerful. Yes, a guy like that is never in a million years going to be right wing. Absolutely. No, I completely agree. Yes, totally.
And so that was the point I'm trying to get at, right? Is that sort of Republican infrastructure is made up of, second sons, right? It's made up of the guy who probably couldn't make it in the kind of like real system of power. Now, don't get me wrong. Like there's certainly like these weird gender goblins who get in, and are just kind of like elevated wildly above their competence. But I think that's another part of that, like lack of a right-wing artistic vision is that like, well, who are we talking about, right? Are we talking about the like, frog Twitter, right? That space where there are, artists and interesting people, or are we talking about like, TP USA, who I mean, like makes me want to just like wash my mouth out with buckshot or something.
Although there's more and more crossover. We're trying to get all these people together in the same room and like rub off on each other. I think that's a little bit of like the goal here. But true.
But I mean, how do we motivate those guys unless we tell them we think they're incredibly uncool and just bully them like it's a high school lunchroom?
Well, and you're right. They need to be in the environment where they, can see what these things mean. But again, I think as you're saying, very definitely, if they were the kind of people that were gonna be cool, they would have taken the option when they had the chance, right? I mean, it's like if Ben Shapiro was not such a perfect outer party participant, I don't think he's conscious of this. I don't think Ben Shapiro is sitting there thinking I'm working for the left, even though he is. But he, again, if he was ever going to be cool, he certainly had the opportunity, right? Because he was at Harvard. He could have easily taken that path, but he chose to, be the dork. He chose to be the blowhard.
To lean into it, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, right? You've mentioned that you've you've worked in advertising, kind of the visual space. So how do you see that as a way to sort of, get our ideas across using those tools?
You said the visual space?
Yeah. So using kind of, I'm sorry, I'm struggling for words here. Using the kind of like, aesthetic sensibility of advertising, using those tools, right? Branding to kind of take our ideas, which, let's be honest, they are from certain perspective dry, and giving them that kind of like, X factor, that sort of appeal.
So I really wish that this piece was out, because it's not out yet, but I just wrote a very long treatise on propaganda and rooted in Bernays. So Bernays is the father of modern day propaganda. A lot of people talk about Alinsky. Alinsky is sort of a evolution of Bernays in the specific, ultra specifically for left-wing politics. But here's what's so surprising about there's a great Hemingway story where he's talking about, I think it's in Hill's like White Elephants. And he's talking to the woman at the train station. And he has this thing where he's like, they're talking about having a job. And he says, there's a few industries in the world where it really matters how you look. And advertising is one of them. And that really struck me and like stuck with me, because I was like, what is he talking about? Like, why does this even matter? Like, what does he mean by this? And when I got a job in advertising, it was like walking around in a cave and like stumbling through a doorway into like a land of milk and honey that you had no idea was there. It was like, what? Like, I could do this for a living? Are you kidding me? It's like, it was the hottest girls you've ever seen. So much money. Everybody's just being creative. You're doing drugs, you're flipping golf carts. It really was like Mad Men, right? It was the updated version of Mad Men. And this was like 2013. So this was the end of the road. This was the very end of the road for advertising as we knew it, right? And when we say this word advertising, this is honestly the right's biggest weakness, in my opinion. And this is why I do what I do. Right-wing people, when they hear advertising, they think a poster. They think like it's a print ad in a magazine, or they think like it's a commercial that they see on TV, and they think that these ads are completely separable from the entire power structure. They don't connect in their mind that everything you're seeing is a machination of economic propaganda. And the ad part is just the very, very tip of that iceberg, right? Did you watch the Super Bowl?
Yes, I did.
Okay. So remember at the Super Bowl, there was Post Malone in a cowboy outfit singing America the Beautiful, right? And then, oh, sorry, I have this stupid thing where it like the thumbs up happens. But then they cut to the Bud Light section at the Super Bowl where the seats are like blue. Post Malone is in there, who's in the Bud Light ad that is airing at the most peak time of the Super Bowl next to the Pfizer ad. Who else is in the section next to Post Malone? Shane Gillis, who is posting about Bud Light, right? And then in the commercial for Bud Light, there's Dana White, who went on Tucker Carlson to tell people to forgive Bud Light, alongside with Kid Rock, who also is doing the same thing. And Kid Rock is also now, a super anti-Palestine. So what you're seeing, the ad that you're seeing is just it's a little visual and argument. It's a little argument that is part of a massive economy that is how propaganda works in America, right? And there's a reason why you can't study to be in the advertising world, right? There's like 2 schools in the entire country that are advertising schools, right? You can study marketing, you can study these other things, and you can, you can get a job at an agency, right? But there's a reason why there's no clear track into those agencies. It's hard. They're hidden, right? It's hidden like that. And that's what Hemingway meant. Hemingway meant you can't just be a Harvard grad and walk into Wyden Kennedy or Edelman, right? These huge propaganda organizations. You can't get a job there just because you went to Harvard. You have to have a certain appearance and you have to have a certain like portfolio. I mean, for me, it's a portfolio. It's being a writer. The fact that I wrote for Vice, that was my ticket in there because they thought that was so cool, right? So like getting into these like huge propaganda organizations is very hard. And it doesn't lend itself to the right. There's no right-wing people in these organizations because one, it's hyper female, but also right-wing people don't think this way. They don't. They think of, you know, then this is something that I just like, even somebody like Orrin McIntyre, who's great, his understanding of aesthetic and propaganda is not, he doesn't realize how deep the rabbit hole goes, right? Like they think I'm going to make rationalist arguments. And that's what propaganda is. They think if I make a really good tagline and, you know, put it on TV and make a really good argument for this thing or that thing for my politician or for my product, that's all I need. And that's just not how it works at all. Like it's so much more involved with money and power and groups of private interests coming together to create these moments in culture.
Well, and that's why that, you know, Bernays' book, I think it's Engineering Consent, I believe is the name of his book. The Engineering of Consent.
One of his that I've ever read is Propaganda. I think Engineering Consent, let's see. What is Engineering Consent? That was later. That was a later essay of his. That was
yes. And so I recommend that to people as sort of a jumping off point because it's very accessible. But one of the interesting things about Bernays, right, is that I believe he's Freud's nephew.
Yeah.
And is actually largely responsible for his popularity in the US. He published his work. And was also sort of his weird handler in the US. There's a whole rabbit hole to go down there. But this idea, and you're 100% right, that sort of advertising is the wrapping paper for an economic transaction is sort of limited. Yes. And I think it's a holdover from the kind of like, you know, Reaganite conservative attitude where essentially everything is, it's about the economy, stupid, right? Where everything is just on that simple layer of like dollar and cents. And, you know, while there's certainly an aspect of that to it, you know, I think we need to go back to Bernays himself, right? Like his famous ad campaign for American tobacco, right? The Freedom Stick, you know, getting, you know, that famous kind of staged photograph of the suffragettes smoking a cigarette, exactly. Right? It's like, okay, well, is that economic? Yes. It was very, very helpful for, you know, the tobacco industry. Is it political? Yes. Is it sort of a lifestyle claim? Like, yes, all at once. And to look at it from only one dimension, you sort of miss out on, you know, kind of like the actuality of what's happening.
Yes, exactly. It's the right is uniquely positioned to be bad at this because they're too pure, you know, like they are too pure in their minds to be willing to play these games. And they're also like a little too smart. And I've noticed this in dealing with the right. I've noticed this so much in dealing with right-wing people. They're very disagreeable. You know, they're very intelligent in a rational way. And they can't quite believe that everyone is such a prostitute that they are. But the reality is celebrities, media companies, brands, universities, but let's just stick with celebrities. We have the misunderstanding that celebrities are artists. Celebrities are not artists. Celebrities are publicity pawns. That's why they exist. That's why they're there. Primarily, you get maybe 1 out of 100, or, you know, even 1 out of 10 that is an artist, right? And we have this apex fallacy that that's what they're all doing. That's not what they're doing. They are there to deliver messages to the public. That's the entire point. I used to do these deals for these for huge stars. I'm talking about like the biggest stars in the world. When my first job in LA, these packages for these publicity contracts, right? They're overseas brands. So we don't even see this stuff here. It's like, when George Clooney's shilling the whiskey in Japan. So we don't even see this. But these contracts, they have 2 shoot days where you're doing the actual commercial. And then there's a package of publicity days that are like 7 or 14 or 21 days or more, where that celebrity just has to do whatever the brand wants. Like they just do whatever they want that day. They have to go on a certain podcast and say a certain thing. They have to appear on Instagram and say something. That's all sorted out later. So there's 2 days of shoot and 21 days of just doing publicity. This is the point of a celebrity, right? This is why celebrities they're a musician and then they're an actor and then they're a, whatever else they're doing, because that is the entire purpose of them. That's 90% of the purpose of a celebrity. Same thing with an expert. We say the experts. We have this notion that the experts are sitting around doing research on everything. Like, oh, there's experts out there just sitting around and they're just researching, whatever comes to their mind. It's like, no, an expert is a propagandist. They only get paid to say propaganda. They don't get paid to do anything else. Again, you have maybe 1 out of 100 experts or 1 out of 10 that rise up and they tell the truth and et cetera, et cetera. And that's great. And we love those people. But the vast majority of experts, the reason they exist is to create and spread propaganda. And I just think that realization, the right wing is starting to get it by talking about patronage networks, which, Bog Beef is, God bless Bog Beef. He's one of my favorite people because he does understand this. But I think that we're just starting to get, the right is really just starting to understand how these propaganda networks work.
Yeah, there's something else that I think is interesting. So I wrote a Substack post today, linked in the description, where I kind of pulled from this author Toynbee, right, who has a really interesting conception of how regimes sort of change and morph over time, and he talks about the kind of the creative minority, and what he says is that basically civilizations face challenges. And eventually there comes a challenge that is sort of unanswerable by the current elite. And, the people who answer that question, the creative minority, sort of assume control, right? So in the case of, FDR, right, the American economy, the world economy basically starts falling apart. FDR and his guys say, well, we can fix it. And, by virtue of being the guys who fix it, they basically get to remake society in their image. Now, slowly over time, that creative elite minority of competent people is replaced, by the next guy up. And as that decays, they sort of lose their creativity, their ability to answer the questions, until they're replaced with a ruling class that is just a dominant minority. They're not elite. There's nothing great about them. They're just in charge. And eventually, there comes a problem that they cannot answer. Either, the society falls apart, or someone comes up and says, well, I can answer it. And by hook or by crook, wrest control of it. And I think we're sort of at that moment now, right, where there are these questions that our elite cannot answer. There's a multitude of them. Definitely. But what's interesting in his analysis there is the way that he kind of describes creativity, the ability to kind of solve a problem in a certain way that others have not thought of, right? Which obviously you can apply to politics and mathematics, to like the visual arts, anything. Right. But this kind of like innovation that sort of needs to happen for things to carry on. And, we've talked about the kind of like the incredible nature of, celebrity, of branding, of all of this to create the narrative. I think one of the really interesting things that's happened, and it's happened incredibly quickly since Obama, is that the liberal progressives have become really embarrassing. And that's sort of something that once it's happened, you can't really recover from it. And look, that doesn't mean the Republicans are cool. The Republicans are like, punk rock now, as many times as that's been said. But it does mean that there's just a ton of embarrassing people everywhere. And that's an interesting situation to be in.
Absolutely. I mean, like, I think the key number there is just look at the Oscars. You look at the viewership. It's amazing that more people don't talk about this. The viewership of the Oscars looks like this. It's like straight down. They're hemorrhaging, since COVID, basically. And that was really the moment. I mean, COVID, then Trump was really when they lost it, especially COVID. COVID, that was their death. They don't know this yet, but that was really when they killed themselves. And you see, since COVID, it's not just like normal viewership, goes up and down, maybe down a little bit, maybe up a little bit. This is unbelievable. Like, people in the future will talk about this. They'll be like, why did in the span of 4 years, everyone in America stop watching the Oscars? It's crazy. It's like it used to be the Super Bowl, right? And now no one watches it. They've all turned it off. It's garbage. Fuck it. We don't care about any of these people. And that shows you exactly what you're saying. It's like they have lost the ability to hypnotize a very large percentage of the country. Now, if you see what they're doing, I just had PCM Christ on my podcast. Do you know who that is?
Yes, I'm familiar with the account.
Yeah, so he's around. He has an article that I accidentally titled my article that's coming out the exact same thing, which is Chihuahua Turns Right, the Hulu, however you say it. And I think we're arguing different things, but basically I think what you're seeing now with Bud Light, with Pfizer, with, Travis Kelce being manufactured, with everything that just happened at the Super Bowl, you're seeing, as you're saying, people inside the system, inside the existing artistic establishment, trying to recapture the minds of the people they've lost, right? All those people who stopped watching the Oscars. They're trying to get those people back. But they're not going to be able to do it. I mean, they're trying, but they're going to fail. And then, then it comes, who is going to fill this space? Who's going to come up and say, we can create a cultural mechanism that sweeps in enough people that we're not just utterly divided to the point where the country is going to die, right?
Yeah, I think that, there's sort of this cul-de-sac of like vaguely anti-woke media analysis, and you see the like horrible clickbait, based Sean Strickland destroys Machine Gun, like all this kind of like absolute tripe, like just awful. But what's interesting in that, right, is the idea that the propaganda machine is to a certain degree broken. You look at movies, that are quite good, but even something like, American Beauty is a great example. If you actually dig down into it, that's quite a subversive film. But, the pill is sort of coated in enough sugar. It's a compelling movie that it sort of slips by, your natural defenses. And in much the same way that we've seen, the decrease in kind of like skilled workers, if you want to use that phrase, in politics. You see the same thing in media. There's an article going around that basically says that like women 3x'd, like went from being 20 to 60% of writers from about like 2010 to 2023. And one, you can really tell, but also, effectively they've lost that propaganda outlet, and one of the kind of interesting stories behind the scene, and I am saying this with no value judgment attached to it whatsoever, that Asians are the new Jews. Right. And you see this explicitly in kind of Hollywood media. People are saying like, oh, like we need quotas for, people of Jewish descent in Hollywood. And if you look at where the kind of like actually interesting films are coming from, they're coming from Korea. Right? They're coming from elsewhere. Hollywood is kind of lost, with all but a few exceptions. It's lost that kind of creative spark.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not trying to take this into a go woke, go broke direction, but it is interesting to see that once you've kind of lost that X factor, that creative spark, you really can't force it, and once it's gone, it seems to be gone.
Well, and I think what you've said, yes, I completely agree with. I rewatched Squid Game recently. It's so good. And I'm just amazed. It's like, right, like they've got it. They've got the flame. And no matter what they do, you can just feel it. You can feel that they've got it. For a while there, the Mexican directors came and saved Hollywood. For about 5 minutes, we had Cuarón, we had what's his name, whose movies I absolutely hate.
Rob Rodriguez.
No, Robert Rodriguez is great. I love his old movies. No, what's his name he does like the magical realism movies.
He directed
Del Toro.
Yeah, he directed Blade 2, I think.
Yeah, but dude, his most recent stuff, like the one about the fish, horrible, and also very woke. But he and then Cuarón, and then there's the one other, the guy who did Amores Perros, Inarritu. They came around to they saved Hollywood for about 5 seconds, and that before, again, as you're saying, they just couldn't keep it together anymore. Probably because they were Mexican, probably because they still had some tradition of making movies in a non, woke communistic fashion. Whereas now, yeah, the light is out for sure, and we're feeling it. But I think what's interesting about what you're saying is like, this pattern happens over and over and over again throughout history. This is nothing. What's happening now with the mainstream artistic establishment is nothing new, right? I mean, it's kind of a conquest law. It's very conquest laws-y to me, right? It's like once it is abandoned by its founders, or they just die, whatever, and then the rules start to get pushed a little bit, right? Like those values that was keeping it going, they start to get fuzzy, and maybe we can compromise here and here and here. And then slowly but surely over time, that institution becomes basically a socialist blood feast for its employees. It completely loses whatever mission it had before. And I think that that's basically what's happened to Hollywood, right? And the woman question is interesting because it's like, again, this process has been happening forever without women. It can also happen with men. It's just when women are involved and the workforce is doubled and women act and think the way they do, it's like Robert's Conquest's second and third laws, like on super steroids, which is like what's happening now.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up Del Toro because I've mentioned before, it's not my formulation, that anti-fascism is the religion of the regime. And Del Toro is kind of the perfect example of that because not only does, and you see it in Pan's Labyrinth very clearly, that he enjoys this sort of inhuman inversion, right? Like, the demon monster that wants your baby, he's not that bad. The real monster is, guys in Hugo Boss uniforms, right? Like that's the really evil thing. But it's especially interesting because
that's a very well put. You're right. It's like the demon is actually good and the guy in the suit is actually bad, right? Like that's the point of his movies. Totally. Yeah.
But in addition to that, it sort of shows the narrative problem of the kind of current civic religion, right? Because to be honest, the progressives have won everything since, World War II. And now if they show a world in which there's evil, it sort of brings up that uncomfortable question of like, well, who's at the wheel here?
Yeah.
And so like, evil is something that people in the past did. It's something that guys in Hugo Boss uniforms did. Like that is what true evil is. And so you sort of have to move it back into the past in a way that is not particularly convincing. And I don't think that's the only issue, but I do think that he's sort of so on the nose with that, that it sort of is useful for showing off that point.
And I think you're 100% correct that a part of the reason why the artistic establishment is failing is they don't have compelling heroes. They don't have compelling heroes and they don't have compelling bad guys because, when we were seeing Nazis and Schindler's List when we were all in 6th grade, it was very compelling because we just hadn't seen it that many times yet. We'd seen it, but it was very like, okay, yeah, this feels about right. This guy's bad, this guy's good. This is exciting. Seeing this on a huge, Saving Private Ryan, we've never seen this before. This is fucking awesome, right? But then we saw it 7,000 fucking times. And it got to the point where we're like, okay, it's not 1945 anymore. Like, surely there is bad guys and good guys happening now, right? But they have no, as you're saying, they have no answer for that. They have no ability to show bad guys and good guys today, because that would require acknowledging their flaws. Have you seen this show, The Curse?
No, I haven't.
So the show, The Curse, it's Nathan Fielder and Benny Safdie. And Benny Safdie's awesome. Benny Safdie is an awesome creator. But, fuck Nathan Fielder, but he's kind of good in this. What's amazing about a lot of prestige TV, including The Curse, is there are no good guys anymore, right? Good guys are basically gone. You still see it, the original True Detective, of course, I love. There's good guys in that. There's heroes. But the regime actually is getting pretty good at making bad guys. So The Curse is all bad guys. Everybody in this show is bad. There's nobody good. There's no hero. Everybody is bad. And you're seeing this more and more in prestige TV. So what's weird is that the establishment, the regime, is starting to be good at recognizing its own bad. And The Curse is very good at this. The Curse is like, it's made by Jews, but if it wasn't made by Jews, it would be outwardly anti-Semitic, right? Like it is like everybody in it is like a bad Jewish landlord who's manipulating, and like it's all the classic tropes. But since it's made by, Benny Safdie and Nathan Fielder, it's okay, right? But it's like, if it wasn't, you would be immediately canceled. But, and this is not to say that Jews are the bad guy of modern life. I'm just saying this particular type of progressive landlord, like gentrifier, is a character that, you can see in real life. And it's super accurate. It's so well done. The problem is there's no hero. Who would the hero be in this circumstance? They're totally fine with showing us the evil of, Harvey Weinstein, somebody like that, or the evil of a tech company, right? But they can't make a hero, because if they made a hero, the hero would be somebody like you, right? It would be somebody like me. It would be somebody who's saying the truth and who's anti-woke and who's who's right-wing. That's what the hero would be, right? And
I think that
they just can't create that. They can't do it, because then they would get in trouble, right?
Well, and I think that part of it too is dealing with that premise of equality, right? That equality is fundamentally anti-heroic, right? The idea that everyone is the same. Yeah. And that it kind of invariably leaves you to the lowest common denominator. And so, like, actually, not to keep.
Well, but hold on. But is that 100%? But what about like a hero like MLK, right? He's heroic, right?
Yeah, but MLK is very much past his sell-by date, right? Like, you'll notice that he is being replaced with new figures, right? But that is the one acceptable heroic archetype, right? Which is the rebel, which is the, I came into the system and turned it over. And this is why, again, it goes back to anti-fascism, right? The acceptable hero is the French Revolution. It is the kind of like ragtag group of people who, like the rebels in Star Wars, right? Who overturn this social order. But again, that's why I'm saying that it matters that progressives are in charge, because that story sounds dumber and dumber and dumber when you and your friends are writing that story and you've been in charge of everything for longer than I've been alive, yes. My parents have been alive, and my grandparents have been alive.
Right.
But I think that the reason that they're uncomfortable with heroics, right? And you see this in like Marvel Cape shit, where like there will be 2/3 of a heroic arc, and then they sort of need to yank it at the last minute. It'll be like, oh, well, that was awkward, kind of grin at the camera, like incredibly cringe, groan-inducing. So I think it's because they feel uncomfortable with that. Like they kind of want their cake and to eat it too. Like they want to have a traditional kind of like hero's narrative, but it doesn't feel real, because again.
What example did you just use for that arc thing? That's really true though.
The heroic arc. I mean, you could just look at like any, like I haven't watched a Marvel movie since fucking 2018, but I'll go off my memory here, right? Like take someone like Thor, right? Like basic bitch character, but you want to have, an arc to that. But what do? They give him most of an arc, like, oh, he's overcome his kind of brash nature, but then they need to make him a fat piece of shit and turn him into like a comedy, like bit character. Yeah. And I think that part of that is that like, okay, well, it's a soulless Disney movie, right? There's part of that. But I think another one is that there is no true hero, because that requires you to have someone who is just better. Yukio Mishima has this great quote, and I can't say it offhand, where it basically says like the only people who kind of laugh at heroism and laugh at hero worship, the idea of taking someone to be inspirational, are basically ugly freaks with an inferiority complex. And I think that that's part of it. But again, when you've accepted that poison pill of equality, everyone is the same. There's no quality differentiator between men. You cannot have a hero. And this goes back to fucking Homer, right? That
well,
Homer's
the only hero you can have is sorry to interrupt, but the only hero you can have is someone who enforces equality, right? That you can have a hero, because the equality argument is actually so tempting, right? I mean, think about when you were a kid. I mean, like, I certainly believed all this shit, right? I certainly looked at slavery as, when I was seeing these images, nobody had to convince me that someone being, enslaved because they were this color was bad. That just appears bad, right? I mean, so it's like people do have an innate sense of justice. And that's part of why the temptation of the left is so strong, and why they win is because they just hammer this thing like over and over and over again. So I do think that it is possible to have a hero who is trying to override a unequal system, right?
Well, so here's my argument. And again, I'm going to use kind of like, Disney slop, because that's the thing most people have seen, right? Like, take the original 70s Star Wars. That still has that anti-fascist message, right? Like, the Empire, let's be honest, it's space Nazis versus the space French Revolution, or space French resistance fighters, right? But who do you have, right? Like, you have a bunch of like kind of suave, cool looking guys who like swing across the gap, kiss the babe, and then ride off into the sunset, right? Like, it's not particularly, sophisticated stuff, but it fires off your monkey brain. You're like, yeah, I want to be Han Solo. I want to be cool.
Yeah, right.
And then look at the kind of modern version of it, and like, you have all the same beats, but like, it's this weird, sexless kind of like amalgam, where like, yes, it still has those arcs in theory, but we sort of lost the kind of verve behind them. And so, like, if you look at the Greek understanding of heroes, right, which I think is really important, right? It's this idea that like these great heroes, and there's actually a whole different word in Greek, which I cannot remember, for heroes, that's kind of above anthropos, man, and below the god, right? You are literally like half and half. You're in between. You've transcended mortality in a way. And I think that is a very fundamental human understanding of like the heroic, but it requires that ability to make a value judgment. And to one last quote, and I'll throw it back to you, but Alistair McIntyre, who wrote Beyond Virtue, has this really interesting argument where he basically says that like the left is very, very comfortable using moral language, right? Like ought, better, worse, to attack the concept of value judgment. And the problem is, and I think that's where we are now, once you eat away at that, you're kind of gone. You've run out of fumes of a moral society. Those moral claims don't mean anything anymore, because you've taken away the kind of underpinning they depended on, which is having a culturally accepted concept of better, worse,
of good and bad.
Bad. Right. And so they've sort of sawn away at the limb they're sitting
on. I'm trying to wrap my mind around what you just said about they are very comfortable using value judgments, and that's obviously true, right? They love saying you should do this, you should do this, you should do this. This is good, this is bad. This is, they love that. And I think right-wing people definitely are much more libertarian, right? Naturally, they're not there really to point the finger. But as you're saying, the irony is that actually the right-wing ones are people who do have a coded morality, whereas the ones on the left are people who do not have a coded morality, because everything's relative. So it's very ironic that the one side uses these value judgments and the other side doesn't use them. That's really fascinating.
And I think that again goes back to that, like, what do we mean by right wing? Because I think that the libertarian moment is really done. You see this, the Libertarian Party itself is exploding. Anyone there who had interesting ideas has left one way or another, and so you're sort of left with this kind of like shambling husk of itself. But I think that we're seeing the same thing happen in the kind of Republican circles where it's like, look, like Trump is the Republican Party and Trump is not a libertarian in that way. Right? Like he's not a particularly sophisticated actor, right? He kind of just is, like, from a certain perspective, kind of libidinal. It's like, I like this, I don't like that. But I think that, that kind of perspective is falling away. And I think that's probably, a good thing for the right. But Isaac, we are fast approaching the end of our time. This was a great conversation. I completely lost track of time. But if people want to find you, what's a good way for them to do that?
Well, you can subscribe to The Carousel on Substack, podcast and writing. I write for the American Mind. I write for the Federalist and a few other places. So you can find me on Twitter, Disgraced Propagandist. And I run a business called WILL, WILL, that does propaganda for, like actual propaganda for various organizations in our world, and trying to build these sort of cultural leaders that you're talking about. So yeah, that's where I am. Well, again, man, I appreciate your time. This was really fun. As far as my links, you guys know where to find me. The show's available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. I have a Substack, which will be linked down in the description. And you can check out a new article that's coming out today on The Blaze. So I'll be sure to link that as well. Let them know that I sent you. And again, Isaac, thank you so much for your time. Wait, is this your first Blaze piece, or have you been writing for them for a while? First one. Yeah. Cool. It just happened. It's part of the reason, actually, that I haven't posted on Substack in a while before this morning, is that I was writing this piece for them and really wanted to make sure it was a good one. So I took extra time. Oh, nice. Okay. Well, looking forward to reading that. Oh, and one more thing. I forgot this. You can check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. JD is a legitimately terrifying human being. He could probably rip you in half. And so you should support his business, or else he just might rip you in half. And to everyone at home, remember, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.